So over the years, I've had a lot of fun covering many different audiophile components, but I've never reviewed something quite this expensive before. So let's prepare to get fancy, put our pinkies up, and prepare to have a good time with the new Classé Delta series. Let's go. Alright, so here it is, the Classé Delta preamplifier with the matching stereo amp. Now, I'm not sure how you all feel, but I absolutely love the way that it looks. The color, the styling. I have to say, if Darth Vader was an audiophile, I'm pretty sure this is the gear that he would roll with. Now, to kick off this video, I'm going to give you all a short backstory on how this gear came to the marketplace. Partially because I find the story interesting, but mostly because I find parts of that story to be hilarious. And the short version goes like this. As many of you know, Classé was originally a high-end electronics company out of Canada. They were founded in the early 1980s, and throughout the 80s and 90s, they were very successful. So successful, in fact, that they caught the attention of a larger audio company named Bowers & Wilkins, who said, hey, we'd like to roll around in that Cabbage Patch. And so they acquired Classé in the early 2000s. Now, for a while, they had a great relationship. However, by 2010, most of the manufacturing had shifted from Canada to China, and then by 2017, the parent company of Bowers & Wilkins decided to jettison Classé altogether, meaning that it looked like it was game over for Classé. That's it, they were done. That is, until Sound United came into the picture and said, I think there's something we can do with this. So they acquired Classé in 2018 with two primary objectives. The first was to hire back the original Classé team. That way they could keep design work and service work in Canada. And the second was to move production from China to their own facility in Japan. The last decision is what had some pretty hilarious implications. So to set this up, as some of you may know, Sound United owns Marantz and Denon, which means they have access to a number of different parts. The problem is, Classé uses almost none of those parts, so they had to go through the process of importing almost all the parts inside of these units to Japan, and they also had to go through a certification process, which took the better part of 1.5 years. And then on top of that, the facility in Japan did not have a machine capable of bending this metal. So what was their solution? It was so old school, it's hilarious. Basically, they use a wheel with spokes around it, kind of like a capstan wheel. I have an image of that floating around so you can see what I mean. And what they do is they have people get on either side of this wheel, push on it, and that in turn creates torque, which allows you to bend the metal to the desired shape. And I don't know, I find that to be so hilarious. And yet, on the silver lining side of things, at least that means that this gear is as close to handmade as it gets, at least when it comes to the casework. So I don't know, maybe I just have a weird sense of humor, but I thought that was a story worth sharing. Anyway, now it's time to talk about the components under review. Alright, so let's kick things off with the brains of the operation, the Delta preamplifier. So right up front, the first thing that you all need to know about Classé is that all of their gear is designed to be neutral, or, in other words, to pass the signal from point A to point B with as little alteration as possible. The idea being is that if you can achieve this, that means when you listen to your music, you'll be able to experience the recordings for what they really are, as well as the sound of your loudspeakers for what they really are. Now, of course, to accomplish this, they have to rely on low noise circuitry, which is why all of their components feature a natively balanced circuit, which means if you want to get the best performance out of this gear, then you'll need to be prepared to break out those XLR cables. Another feature is going to be signal path isolation. Let me explain what that means for a second. So let's just say you have a number of different source components connected to this preamp and you say, I'm in a mood to listen to CDs. So you select the input for your CD player, and that's going to automatically disable all the other inputs that are not in use. Beyond that, you can go in and bypass every feature that you're not using in this preamp to ensure the shortest, most pure, and most low noise signal path possible. Speaking of low noise, it uses a 400-step low noise volume control that adjusts in quarter dB increments. So yeah, very, very precise stuff. Next to that, we are going to have a built-in headphone amp. Now, it's not going to be the most powerful headphone amplifier in the world. I believe it's around 0.5 watt into 32 ohms, but it does sound very good. Very clear, detailed, balanced, dynamic, and very spacious. Next to that, we are going to have a USB input that's compatible with most major operating systems like Windows, Android, and iOS. And then next to that, we have a button to access our touchscreen menu. Now, while it's cool that the Classé preamp has a touchscreen menu, I found the interface to be a little bit clunky, and I found that using the remote control, which I have professionally set up on the floor, doesn't exactly help things out. Although, to be fair, this is a well-made remote control and you can use it as a blunt weapon if you want. If somebody's seriously considering this preamplifier, then I would suggest that they just download the Classé app because it is so much more convenient and intuitive to use. Now, when it comes to features, there's a lot to go over, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to place this camera on a tripod and then go over what it has and also what it's missing. So, the first thing is going to be a built-in moving magnet, moving coil phono stage. Now, I didn't have the opportunity to listen to it first, but in fumbling around in the menu system, I found that it's pretty much compatible with any turntable setup you can imagine. Now, one of the things I was able to listen to is the built-in DAC, which is going to be a 32-bit DSD-capable DAC using the AKM 4497 chipset. And the cool thing here is that it actually has 8 of those DAC chips inside of this preamp in a dual differential configuration. Moving on, when you go into the menu, you'll notice that it has tone controls, because even though Classé is going for a neutral response, they understand that not everybody wants that sound all of the time. So if you want to add some spice to the sound, you have the opportunity to do it. And the cool thing is you can assign the different tone control configurations for different inputs, so it doesn't affect everything. Next, it comes with a bass management system, so you can select the frequencies and the slopes to really help integrate the subwoofers with your speakers, should you decide to use any. And then next, it does have streaming capabilities built in, but here's the caveat. You can only connect via a hardwire connection, so it's meant to connect to your network instead of allowing you to stream wirelessly from your device directly to the preamp. And when I asked Classé about it, they said it's all about the noise. They find that the wireless interfaces are just way too noisy, and plus up until lately there's been an issue with dropout, particularly when it comes to streaming high resolution files. So they want to just remain on brand and go with the best route possible, which is connecting to your network. Now, another feature they do not have is going to be in-room EQ software like Dirac or ARC, Anthem, Lindorf, and so on and so forth. And this is where things get controversial, because when I asked Classé about that, they said, well, they just straight up don't believe the sound quality is there and that the performance of this software is consistent. And this is where, subjectively speaking, I'm kind of halfway with them and halfway not there. The reason being is I think from 300 hertz, on up, I agree with them. I think that the sound quality is definitely not quite there yet, but from around 300 hertz on down, this is where I think that in-room EQ actually serves a lot of great utility, because let's face it, most of us have issues in low frequencies within our rooms, and this software does a great job of correcting that. So I hope that in the future, Classé kind of reconsiders this position and maybe introduces this software, but maybe with limited function. Anyways, that is going to be it for the features of this preamplifier. So now let's go over the big boy stereo amp. Okay, so I just lifted this amplifier onto the shelves, and I don't mind saying, guys, this is one of those moments where I question why I continue reviewing hi-fi gear. And that's because this amp's supposed to weigh 102 pounds, but I'm telling you all right now, that number is a lie, because in reality, this amplifier weighs closer to that of a dying star. I don't know. Maybe I'm just being dramatic, maybe it's due to the concentrated weight. All I know is that moving this amplifier around for this review has not been a whole lot of fun. Anyway, my complaints aside, let's move on by starting off with the power specifications of this amplifier. So Classé rates the Delta Stereo as outputting 250 watts per channel into 8 ohms, 500 watts per channel into 4 ohms, and 350 watts per channel into 2 ohms. It's important to note that this is a high current design, meaning that instead of chasing these big and impressive power figures, Classé designed this amp to safely drive pretty much any loudspeaker you can think of. It's also important to note that the first 12.5 watts are biased for Classé operation because, you know, Classé the brand, Classé bias. Anyway, let's move on and discuss the features of this amp. So the main feature is going to be this aluminum cooling tunnel. So instead of having traditional heat sinks to dissipate heat, they have this cooling tunnel, and this is how it works. You have a fan mounted to it. That fan draws in air from the outside, passes it through this tunnel where our transistors are mounted, and then that air exits through the exhaust. And the whole idea is temperature regulation, because as many of you know, many high-power Class AB amplifiers generate a lot of heat, and this limits where you can place them. Now, with most of these amplifiers, you have to place them in an open-air environment, but apparently, according to Classé, you don't have to do that with the Delta. In fact, if you need to put this in like an enclosed space, like a home entertainment cabinet, you can do that. Another benefit is going to be the longevity of the components inside, because as many of you know, heat kills electronics. So when you don't have a lot of heat to contend with, that means theoretically the components should last for a very long time. So pretty cool stuff. Now, according to Classé, there are 32 total transistors inside of this amp, most of which that we can't see. You're also going to get 215,000 microfarads of filter capacitance, courtesy of 22 Mondorf filter caps. I don't know, maybe the Mondorf logo helps with the low inductance and resistance. Look, I'm just joking here. Mondorf makes great gear, and look, this is a luxury item. This is what you're paying for. So moving on, we have this gigantic toroidal transformer. Now, according to Classé, it has a little over 1 kilometer of copper inside. And look at that, we even have the volt amp rating. 2,700. That's crazy. So that is mostly going to be it. I think the only other thing I need to mention are the analog VU meters. So here's the crazy thing. While these are analog VU meters, apparently there's a digital circuit that they use to determine how much power is being used, because they wanted to make sure that the VU meters are not a part of the output stage. And I think that is absolutely crazy. I can't begin to explain how that actually works, but it's definitely worth mentioning. Anyway, that is going to be it for this amplifier. So I'm going to briefly show you all the back of these components, and then I'm going to share my thoughts on how I think they perform. Okay guys, so here's the back of the Classé stack, and honestly, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time here. And that's because I've already spent 10 minutes rambling on about these components, and I haven't even spoken a word about how it sounds yet. So my advice is that if you're interested in a specific feature, just hit the pause button right now or click on the description box to check out the user manual. However, I am going to comment on at least some of the parts, starting with the RCAs. So Classé uses rhodium-plated Furatech RCAs, very expensive, very well-made stuff. They also rely on these stupidly thick terminals for your speaker cables. This is going to be our exhaust for the amplifier. And real quick, when I was running the Dynaudio Confidence 20s at pretty loud volumes on this amplifier, I noticed that the top of it ran pretty cool. In fact, the only heat that you could experience would be coming from the back of this amp, indicating that the circuit works pretty well. The amplifier also comes with this very fancy audiophile grade power cord, and that is going to be it for this stack. I think the only thing left to mention is, oh yeah, the price. I've totally buried the lead here, and totally not on purpose. So the price of the Pre-Amplifier is 10,000, excuse me, US dollars, whereas the stereo amp retails for 13,000 US dollars, bringing you to a total of 23 grand. And the big question is, what do you get for that kind of money in terms of performance? Well, now it is finally time to talk about how these components sound. So let's get to it. Alright, so let's kick off this review by first identifying who stands the best chance of really enjoying the Classé stack. Now, in my opinion, it boils down to two types of listeners. The first are going to be audiophiles who say, hey look, if I'm spending this kind of money on a set of electronic components, then I need them to just get out of the way of themselves and to do their frickin' job. I need this gear to be the bedrock of my system, something that has enough power and clarity for my needs, while at the same time offering up the kind of neutrality that takes the guesswork out of loudspeaker pairing. If that's you, then you need to check out this gear, because odds are you are going to fall in love with it. And then the second type of listener is actually going to be the professional recording studio engineer, somebody who's looking to assemble a high-end passive system for their studio, and you need something that's linear, powerful, yet at the same time runs cool enough to where you can store it in places that most high-power Class AB amplifiers cannot go. Still, none of this says anything about the sound of these components, so now it is time to dig into those nerdy audiophile adjectives. Let's go. Okay, so we've now landed at the part of the review that I have been dreading for months now. I kid you not, this is not a joke. I've literally held off on reviewing these components for 6 months due to this exact moment right here, which is when I'm supposed to give you all a detailed summary about how the Classé Delta gear performs. And here's the main problem that I'm running into. You see, most of the time when I review other components, I'm reviewing products that have a very distinct sound. And this gives me something to talk about. But with the Classé Delta stack, not only is it fairly neutral, but it excels with literally just about everything that you can think of in terms of a typical audiophile parameter. Dynamic output has it for days. Low noise floor, check. Something that sounds good at low volumes as well as high volumes, check. Tight and controlled and strong bass, an open, full, yet very resolute sounding mid-range, treble that's airy yet easy on the ears. It has all of that, leaving me with very little to talk about. But still, there are at least going to be some things worth discussing here, because try as any company might to achieve absolute neutrality, I found that every component has a distinct sonic signature, and Classé is not an exception to the rule. And overall, I would describe its sonic character as being fairly neutral, incredibly dynamic with a low noise floor, but ultimately on the dark side of neutral with treble that perhaps may be just a little bit smooth. In fact, that's a good launching point for the details, so let's start off with the treble. Now, this is interesting to me because I admit I've read some other reviews before publishing this video, and I noticed some reviewers called the treble a little bit smooth, if not slightly rolled off. And on one hand, I get where they're coming from, but I don't think that's inherently the case. I think the treble is actually pretty darn close to dead nuts neutral here. I think what's really happening is it depends on your reference points. So if you're used to high-end components that maybe emphasize upper mid-range and high frequency information or have a unique distortion characteristic, then yeah, going from that to something like the Classé Delta series, it may come across like the treble's just a little bit muted, and if you're somebody who likes that inherently lively presentation, then you may not like that, or you may have to find yourself using tone controls to compensate for your taste. But overall, I think the treble is absolutely fantastic. Resolution, airiness, spaciousness, localization, the separation of details, all of it is as good as what you would expect for something in this price range. Now, is it always going to be smooth and easy on the ears? Well, in my experience, no. If you're listening to a horrible recording on very revealing speakers or speakers that are more treble forward, then yeah, you are going to know it. However, I think with relatively neutral, if not smooth sounding speakers when paired to the Classé Delta series, like say, Wilson Audio or Dynaudio Confidence series, or even Sonus Faber speakers, then you're going to be in for a pretty good time, almost regardless of the music that you listen to. Now let's move on to the mid-range. Now, I admit that at first I found the mid-range of the Classé Delta stack to be on the cool side, as if it just didn't have enough meat on the bone, particularly in the upper mid-range. Or in other words, the classic signature I'm used to with neutral components. But then I noticed something. Out of the box, some features were activated, so I went into the preamp and I bypassed everything that I wasn't using, which is pretty much everything. And that opened up the mid-range quite a bit. Suddenly it became a lot fuller. There was body and density to the sound, yet it still had that resolution and honestly really, really good tone. I would say equally as good as Accuphase in terms of tone, except better in pretty much every other way. So the mid-range is just absolutely stellar. And then let's move on to the bass. The bass is about as ideal as it gets. It is strong, it's controlled, and one of the benefits of a high current design is not only exceptional bass, but exceptional dynamic output. If you're somebody who listens to classical music where you're going to experience usually the most dynamic contrast in music, then you're going to love this gear. It can go from quiet to loud to quiet with just effortless ease. Now granted, if you use very demanding speakers in a huge room and you listen at very loud volumes, then maybe the mono blocks would be a better fit for you, but still, Classé has done a great job here. So really in every single parameter, they excel. So now let's talk about the DAC. So I did check out the DAC with the AKM4479 chipsets, and I have to say, it's pretty good. The character is in line with the Classé amp itself. It's very open and spacious sounding. It's very clear. Now, I admit I still prefer the sound of my AMR 777 SE. I think my CD player by itself with this built-in DAC sounds a little bit more natural. It rides that balance a little better between resolution and warmth and body and density, and that's really what the built-in DAC of the Classé gear misses, is it doesn't quite have on its own this dimension and depth within the soundstage and this fullness that my AMR has. Otherwise though, it is really good, and I wouldn't be surprised if some people would find that the DAC is good enough to where you wouldn't feel the need or feel compelled to use an external DAC. So I would say that the performance of this gear is absolutely exceptional, which again, you would expect for something at this price, but still, it's not going to be perfect. So let's go over some of those imperfections now. Okay, so far this has been a rave review, but it's not like the Delta series is perfect. So now it's time to discuss some of their issues, starting with the sound. So while the performance of the Classé gear is exceptional in pretty much every regard, it's still not going to make everybody happy. A good example would be audiophiles who love the sound of tube amplifiers and prefer more of a harmonically rich presentation. If that's you, then there's a good chance you're not really going to like the Delta series too much, because while it's good, it still sounds like a transistor setup. Now moving on, let's talk about the user interface on the Pre-Amplifier. Earlier on in this review, I referred to it as clunky, and what I mean by that is when you touch the touchscreen, there's a little bit of a lag between when you touch the screen and it issues a command. And then next, I found the overall interface to be a little bit convoluted and difficult to navigate. Now to be fair, Classé is a hi-fi company. I don't expect them to come up with something that's as sleek as what you'd see from Apple or Samsung or any other major tech company, but still, I hope they can improve on that over time. And then lastly, and really this is going to be the biggest complaint, is mechanical noise, specifically due to the fan inside of the amplifier. In my small, well-treated room, I could hear the fan running even at low listening volumes. And to me, this is really disappointing for an amplifier that, for one, costs that much money, and then number two, otherwise has exceptional performance. Now, in all fairness, I reached out to Classé about the issue and they said, you shouldn't be experiencing that. Yes, you will hear fan noise when you listen at louder volumes, which shouldn't be a problem because you're listening at louder volumes. And then they revealed to me that my review samples have been farmed around to many people, to individual homes, to trade shows, to showrooms, so they're thinking it's just an issue with my review sample. But the reason why I'm reporting it now is because it's my job to reveal what my experience with a product has been like, which just further emphasizes why it's important to try something out either in your home or to spend a lot of time with it in a showroom floor. Either way, guys, I think that's just about it for this review. I think the only thing that we're missing now is some context. So let's go over a quick comparison before I wrap this whole thing up. Okay, so right away, I need to make two things very clear. Number one, the reason why the equipment is on the floor right now is because I don't own a bench or a set of shelves that are strong enough to support the weight of all of these components at the same time. And then number two, I need to also emphasize that this is not going to be a fair comparison. Instead, the whole point is to talk about what happens when you go from an already expensive set of separate components to something that retails for nearly twice the price. Will you notice a difference? Are the differences worthwhile? That's what I'm here to talk to you about today. Now, before we begin, I'm going to briefly go over what I'm comparing to the Delta series, which is going to be the Parasound JC5 stereo amplifier with the matching Parasound JC2BP preamplifier. Designed by the legendary John Curl, I have to say, behind the scenes, these two components are very well respected, with many people actually referring to them as being a good value, which is kind of crazy for something that retails for over $11,000 combined, but I get it. They're well made, and plus, they do tend to hold up well to more expensive gear, which of course leads me to the comparison to the Delta series. So let's start off with the amplifiers here since the cases are open. And I have to say, just from a personal bias perspective, I like the aesthetic of the JC5 a little bit better with the case off, and that's because it's just more traditional. You have the heat sinks on the side, you have more spacing between the major components, you have the blue cover over the transformer, as well as those beer can sized filter caps. Just looks awesome. Now moving over to the Delta series, while it doesn't look as clean, once you take a close look, you'll realize why it retails for more money. Because first, the casework is so much thicker than what you get out of the JC5. The transformer is substantially larger, even though you may not be able to tell on camera right now. You get almost twice the filter capacitance bank, you get a lot more transistors, of course, you get this fancy ice aluminum tunnel, or whatever it is Classé calls it, and overall, the build quality is just on a different level. Now, the interesting thing is that on paper, the JC5 looks like the better amplifier, if for nothing more than its ability to output more power for less money. In fact, Parasound rates this amp as being stable all the way down to 1.5 ohms, at least for brief periods of time. But this is where there's going to be a big difference between the two. While the Parasound is only comfortable with it for a very short burst of time, the Classé is stable at 2 ohm loads and can run them all day long and can handle 1.5 ohm dips with absolute ease. So that's going to be the big difference, is the Classé Delta is meant to drive just about any loudspeaker you can think of, whereas the Parasound starts to get a little bit uncomfortable with speakers that are very difficult to drive. And that leads me to the differences in terms of performance. Now, the interesting thing is that Parasound's also going for neutrality with these two components, but when you listen to them, there's a pretty clear and obvious difference. You don't really need a blind A/B test for this stack comparison. So in short, the Parasound is going to have a nice, balanced presentation to it. It does all the audiophile stuff well, but it's also going to have a little bit of a warm signature to it, particularly within the mid-range. I think this is actually a pleasant thing, but it's going to contrast Classé's approach, which is going to be, by comparison, much cleaner, if not a little bit cooler within the mid-range, maybe a little bit drier of a sound. But ultimately, you're going to get, quite frankly, more performance out of the Delta stack. In fact, by direct comparison, you'll notice that the Delta stack is better in pretty much every conceivable way, most notably a lower noise floor with a lot more effortless dynamic output. But even then, the top end is going to be more extended yet smoother at the same time. The mid-range is going to take on more of an open and clear quality to it. The bass is going to be even tighter and more controlled on the Delta series. It's just pretty much better in just about every single way. And while you may prefer the warmth of the Parasound stack, when you start to encounter, or I should say include tone controls into the mix, then, everything's pretty much a wash, because that's one of the advantages of starting with a neutral platform, is that if you want to introduce coloration, you can do it and basically have your cake and eat it too. So is there a difference between these two? Absolutely. The Classé Delta stack basically builds on what makes the Parasound very good and just takes it to the next level. Now, is it worth it? Well, that depends. I wouldn't say that the Delta series is twice as good as the Parasound stack, because it's not, but it is better in most of the typical audiophile parameters. And the one thing I notice is that the people who can afford something like the Delta stack, oftentimes what they're looking for is, well, number one, is there a difference? Is it audible? And if that's the case, then I'll go with the better solution. So a lot of this is just going to depend not only on your ears, but also on your financial position. But if it were my money, and if I had enough money to afford a Delta stack, that's probably what I would go with. But there's no denying that the Parasound stack offers, relatively speaking, a pretty good value for the money. Anyway, that is going to be my take on how these two components compare to one another. So now it is time to wrap up this review. Okay, so now that we're at the end of this long review, it's time for me to reveal what I truly think about the Classé Delta series. Now look, I'm not going to BS you all. I'm usually not a fan of equipment that's designed to be neutral. The reason being is that if I wanted that kind of a presentation, then I would just skip hi-fi and go with a set of well-engineered studio monitors, which, by the way, I've done many times in the past. And what those experiences taught me is that I'm the kind of listener who enjoys a colorful sounding presentation. In fact, I embrace imperfections because I find them to be interesting and at times emotionally engaging. And yet, I like the Classé Delta stack. Now, I admit that it was not love at first listen. In fact, my immediate reaction to the gear was mixed, because on one hand, I immediately recognized how technically competent the performance was. In fact, in terms of audiophile performance, it's hands down better than everything that I've reviewed at this channel so far. And while I found it to be technically impressive, it didn't really do anything for me on an emotional level. That is, until I went into the preamp and bypassed some features that for some reason were activated. Once I did that, that's when it clicked. That's when I was able to enjoy the merits of what it brings to the table with a presentation that inspired me to just sit down and enjoy the music in my collection. And I don't mind saying that I'm prepared to put my money where my mouth is. I would be more than happy to sell off all the other components I have to buy this stack for myself if it wasn't for the fan noise, which again may or may not be due to my review samples. Anyway, that pretty much wraps up my thoughts on the Classé Delta series. Definitely very good. I think Classé did a great job of executing their goal, and there's something to be said for having that neutral platform to where you can then go ahead and manipulate the sound to taste. So if this is something you think you'd be interested in, I definitely encourage you to check it out. Anyway, that's it for this review. If you've made it this far, I don't know how, but I definitely appreciate it all the same. I always lose it at the end of my videos. Anyways, guys, you go out, have fun, listen to music, and until next time, peace.